Hi, I'm Jeremy Vendetti, and here we are in Mission, British Columbia, looking at the Fraser River. So this is the Mission Railway Bridge just upstream here, and a little bit downstream from here we have the Mission Highway Bridge. So here you can see that we are in a relatively wide valley. We're standing on the floodplain of the Fraser River, and it is a wide floodplain, much different than the reaches that we looked at upstream, where we had the gravel-bedded reach with a relatively narrow floodplain, or where we had when we were in the bedrock reach of the river, where there essentially is not much floodplain to see. So the river here is single-threaded. The grain size of the bed material is about 350 microns, and indeed it is the same size here as it is almost all the way out to the ocean on the riverbed, particularly in the Thalweg. The width of the river here is about 550 meters, and the depth at high flow is on the order of about 15 meters. So Mission represents the upstream limit that tides are able to penetrate in the Fraser River. They penetrate up this far at low flows. At high flows, the tides don't really have much of an effect on water levels in Mission, although they can affect the velocity a little bit at moderate flows. But once we go up to peak flows, the tides have very little effect on water flow up here at Mission. So the sediment load of the Fraser River here at Mission is very different than the sediment load that we saw upstream at Agassiz. There is trace amounts of gravel that get down this far, but most of the gravel stops moving at the gravel-sand transition. There's about 6 million tons of sand that moves past Mission every year. Approximately half of that is bed material, that is the material that makes up the bed and the banks, and half of that, 3 million tons per year, is wash load, and that goes right through the system without building the bed or the banks of the river. We also have a lot of silt that comes through the river here, about 8 million tons per year, and then there's also some clay that comes through the system, about 2.7 million tons per year. In total, on average, the sediment load of the Fraser River here at Mission is about 17 million tons per year. And the bed material, the material that is actually making up the bed and banks and generating the morphology of the Fraser River, is about 3 million tons per year of sand. That information is really important to know because it tells us what the sediment supply is to the Fraser Delta. And in particular, if we want to build a sediment budget for the Fraser Delta and know whether or not the Fraser Delta is aggrading or eroding and how it's changing through time, it's critical to know the sediment load here and how much sediment is moving downstream and going into the channels that ultimately make up the Fraser Delta. Mission, British Columbia, where we are right now, is a good place to talk about flooding in the Fraser River system. The Fraser River system is what we refer to as a snowmelt-dominated river. That means we get low discharges through most of the year, from about October until April. And then in April, as the air temperature begins warming up, we get snow melt that has accumulated over the winter periods, then forming what we call a freshet. And that freshet consists of high flows that generally peak in June or July and then decline. And so the hydrograph of the Fraser River is one in which flows ramp up starting in April or May, They peak in June or July, and then they decline through August, September, and October, back down to low flows. And during that period, snow is accumulating in the mountains. So the largest flood on record here in the Fraser system happened in 1898. And then the flows got to about 17,000 cubic meters per second. And just for reference, the mean annual peak flow in the Fraser River measured at Hope, upstream of here, is typically about 9,000 cubic meters per second. So 17,000 is substantially larger than that. And that flood would have flooded much of the Fraser Valley and downstream. There were a number of other very large floods in the late 1800s. There were large floods also in 1948, 1950, 1972, and 1974. With increases in population in the lower mainland, and in the Fraser Valley in particular, there have had to be defenses built against the flooding. And so there's really quite an extensive dike system through the lower mainland that is intended to prevent water from flooding into communities and often even into farms. Fortunately, the largest floods that we've seen on record were in the late 1800s. And under climate change scenarios that are predicted, it's unlikely we're going to get those really, really big flood flows happening. But there's no reason why we can't get large flows, the types that we've seen back in the 1950s or in the 1970s. And so the dike system is really very important. However, those dikes also block off back channels and side channels in the Fraser system. And those areas are important for fish. Those are the places where fish rear and where they spawn. And so then by cutting off those back channels, we have essentially reduced the spawning habitat for fish in the Fraser River. And so we see once again that there is sort of a battle between people and fish, farming and fish, communities and fish. And it all comes down to what's happening here around the river. And it's important that we recognize these things so we can make good decisions going forward about what sort of river we want and how healthy we want it to be.